There is no other writer in New Zealand who has a greater breadth of accomplishment than Fiona Kidman. She has written over 30 books, including novels, short stories, poetry, and drama. In addition, she has worked as a radio announcer, critic, anthology editor, scriptwriter, and teacher of creative writing. She has given service to many organisations associated with the arts, including Creative New Zealand, New Zealand Society of Authors, and the Book Council. Her work has been widely published overseas, and she has often travelled abroad to represent New Zealand writing. Her awards are too numerous to list here, and you have come to hear from her, not about her from me. I will mention that she has won the Ockham Book Award for fiction, the New Zealand Book Lovers Award, the Ngaio Marsh Crime Writing Award. She has received 2 honours from the French government, including Chevalier of the French Legion of Honour, and of course was created a Dame in our own Queen Honours. Please welcome Fiona Kidman. Fiona, first of all, in your book, So Far for Now, a collection which you term of autobiographical essays, and the reviewer Rachel O'Connor said were like skillfully curated artworks in a retrospective exhibition. Wonderful work. There, the first piece and the last piece I thought were particularly powerful and moving, because there you're talking about the loss of your husband Ian and your subsequent experience in living alone, becoming, as you say, a widow. And I wonder whether perhaps we start by inviting you to share something of that experience with us.
Thank you, Owen. Is that working all right? Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Kia tātou. It's just lovely to be here. I'm so happy to be back in Featherston. Crackling away. Crackling. So I thought that in a response to Owen's question, I would quite like to... too close? Thank you. In response to Owen's question, I'd like to start by doing a reading from one of the essays, which is called On Widowhood, because it's quite a hard subject to pitch oneself into. So I thought that I might start on by if I read that, it might kind of make it a little bit easier to tell you what I'm talking about. So I'll just read On Widowhood. It was early summer in London. The trees were pale green clouds, the lilacs were out. Because the Chelsea Flower Show was in progress, the arches and doorways of hundreds of shops were decorated in floral splendour. I had an Art Nouveau-style apartment in Lower Sloane Street. In the mornings, 50 horses, perhaps more, were ridden past by uniformed men from the royal stables. During those weeks, I met people, talked, gave readings, laughed feverishly. I did interviews at the BBC. I was also in the first season of Widowhood. When someone close to you dies, an undertaker may send you books about grief. The one who organised my husband's funeral did. The little booklets were written by 2 women who had been widowed. They were called The Colour of Grief. At first I was angry when they arrived, as if nobody could access my state of mind, as if my grief was different from that of everyone else who had been through a similar experience. I threw a couple of them away. When I think about that now, I see I was wrong. There was a lot of sensible advice in those booklets. I still have the last one, about the approach of the first anniversary of the death, and recognise how much common sense it contains. One of the things I like is that the writers acknowledge that people who are grief-stricken can be angry. They might not have liked that I threw their books away, but I think they would have understood. Some bereaved people have told me that anger was the last thing on their mind. Others, like me, have felt a sense of rage. I think it has something to do with powerlessness. Death is not interested in what you want. It gets on with its business, and you can't stop it from happening when it's ready. My husband died from an accident at home, and it seems from everyone I've talked to that sudden death is a likely trigger for what looks from the outside like an unseemly response, that and medical misadventure. Men often appear to deal with bereavement differently from women. They either fall apart in an inconsolable way and die, or they get married again very soon. They are sought after. They get asked out to dinners. People don't refer to them often as widowers. People say, "Oh, his wife died, poor chap." Of course, there are exceptions, and I hear myself being accused of generalisations straight away. In his memoir, The Only Story, the writer Julian Barnes describes the grief of his wife's death in a very intense way. He allowed it to show, but a lot of men don't. Because I understand widowhood from a female perspective, through the simple fact of being a widow, I chose to talk to other women in the same situation. There are a lot of us around. Even the Queen is one now. Not that widow is a term I care for. It puts a stamp on you, not in service, used by a date past, or, in a worst-case scenario, huntress on the prowl. Around about a year after my husband died, I was attending a gathering. A man I knew slightly sat down beside me. "Found yourself a husband yet?" he said. I nearly fell off my chair. He was an educated man in a good government job. I think he was sober, but you can't always be sure. "I'm not looking for one," I said, and it was true. "Oh, that's what they all say," he responded, turning away. "You'll find one." I felt a sense of outrage then, of violation, not just of my husband's memory, but of me. I had no interest in finding a husband. There are pleasures in solitude and the freedom of the single life. They're not exclusive of the company of men, but marriage for the sake of it has not been for me. What I might have said that confused evening was that I already had some overtures from men who were hardly an advertisement for their kind. One of them clearly wanted a roof over his head. It hadn't occurred to me that I had such financial cachet. "On the make, on your bike," I had said in effect. So, finding a husband? Not likely. Yet in my several male friends, the ones who had been in both Ian's and my lives seemingly forever, I found the same level of tenderness and support that came from my women friends. In our regular conversations and exchanges, they reminded me of who I was and who I am and who I could trust. My situation might have changed, but I had not.
Thank you, Fiona. I wonder whether, in writing of such personal matters and experience, and I know that you and Ian were particularly close, did you find that a cathartic experience? Was it something to do with personal health that you put that out there, that very personal material?
Yes, well, I think I read that from that piece rather than the opening essay, which is actually about the death of Ian, but I'm afraid I can't read that, it's just too hard. So I was widowed nearly 5 years ago, and you know, you talk about it, and if you're close to your husband, and we were together for 57 years, you just say, what will it be like when if one of us goes, when one of us dies? And you don't really know what it's going to be like. And it's a profound transition from one life to another. And I was really stuck. I think it took me a year or so. The first year, I thought that I was a bit crazy. Very shortly after Ian died, my grandson and one of my grandsons had come out from London for his funeral. And he and I go to the theatre, have always gone to the theatre a lot when he still lived in New Zealand. And we went to the theatre together, and there was a man sitting on one of these little raised tiers, daises, in Circa Theatre. And he fell off his chair and rolled down the stairs. And I found myself screaming, and the play stopped. And I thought, you're seriously unhinged. Fortunately, he was fine. He got up. He'd apparently gone to sleep, I was told afterwards. But anyway, it made me realise that. And so the next day I said to my grandson, Toby, I said, I need to get out of here. And so I booked to get on a plane to go to Europe, which is what I'm doing when I'm in that reading. And that in itself seemed, that was a few months later, but that in itself seemed rather crazy and impetuous behaviour. It took me a year or so to really start to sort myself out, and I wasn't writing. Well, that's not quite true. I had written This Mortal Boy, which I'd finished just a couple of weeks before Ian died. So that year I was also promoting the book everywhere. So it wasn't as if I wasn't working, but I certainly wasn't writing. And to answer your question, I think that I had to write down some of this experience, to process it. And I didn't actually set out to write it as something that was going to be published. It was for myself, just to record what had happened. But as I wrote it, and as I talked to many friends, I realised that this was something that maybe more people would be interested in. And so in the last essay, the one that I've just read from, in fact, I've interviewed 4 or 5 of my own friends and explored also widowhood in other cultures. Maori and touched on very slightly Greek widowhood, Cambodian widowhood, communities that I've been associated with. So I hope that it's something that it's a bit broader than just my own experience, but having that experience, you do bring something about knowledge, some knowledge to it, I think.
Thank you. Also, Fiona, I know that despite Ian's loss, you do have a close, wider family, and I presume to some extent that has compensated. I know you have a very sort of supportive family. Would you like to make a comment about that?
Yes, well, family is very important to me. So maybe just to go back earlier in my journey, if you like, journey of a lifetime, I'll just tell you a little about myself and where I come from. I'm an only child, and I know so many people who belong to big families. In my time, my generation, it wasn't as usual as all that. During World War II, I lived on my grandparents' farm, and my father was in the Air Force. I had a wonderful, loving, close relationship with those Scottish grandparents or descendants of Scottish grandparents. I should say, and can I just digress for a moment here and say that this morning I went to Papakopai Marae, is that? Yeah. And there was some wonderful conversation and discussion about Pākehā European settlers coming to the Wairarapa and how the association between Māori and Pākehā had evolved, and that it was a very positive conversation, which gave me great good heart, because my grandparents in 1840 had come on the Oriental and then come up and settled at Hinekura. So I don't know whether there are any Sutherlands here, but if there are, hi, Cassie Bros. Right. Fine, how lovely. How nice to see you there. We'll talk more. My father was an Irishman. He had immigrated in the late 1920s. I never met his family. I didn't know my grandparents. When we went up to, at the end of World War II, we went up to Kirikiri in the far north in the Bay of Islands, and we went sort of subsistence farming, really, or my parents did. They bought some land sight unseen, and they were fairly rugged years. We lived in a little army hut that my dad had transported onto this bit of land. He was a dreamer, my dad. He was things were always going to be better, but they never quite were, and they were really tough years. And then the significance of his Irish family, who I never knew, was that when I was about 9 or 10 years old, my two great aunts died in Bandon, County Cork, and there was inheritance, and there was a farm, and we went to Waipu to live, and everything seemed to be rosy. There were two or three wonderful years that followed there when my parents were, pretty happy, and I had marvellous times there. It was a great community. So I have a very strong sense of the need for a community around me because I haven't had relatives. On my mother's side, we had moved up north, and I didn't really know the Sutherlands when I was growing up. And my mother was the youngest of a family of 6, and in her branch, until there was only one cousin. So there was just, I had no siblings and no cousins. So when I met Ian when I was 19 and he said, let's get married, I said, let's. So I had this, my dream was always of having children and having a family. And so in answer to your question, yes, family is immensely important to me. And in fact, I only had 2 children. I say only, but they're just amazing. I mean, they're the kind of kids that would fill anybody's lives. They're wonderful. But I have 6 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. So I reckon I'm doing pretty well. All up now, for an only child, with all this sort of absences in my life, I now have, with all the people that I've married into my family and so forth, I look around and I think 19 descendants, not bad, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Fiona. I'd like to move on, perhaps to talk a little bit about something that I mentioned in the introduction. Sorry about that. Do remind me to keep the microphone up. That you are an enthusiastic and experienced teacher of creative writing, and there's a very interesting piece in the book where you talk about teaching memoir writing over a number of years. So I wonder whether you could comment on how important the teaching has been in your career.
When it comes to writing memoir, I'd like to use the word facilitator rather than teacher. I think that it's something that you can help people to find themselves. So in the book, I describe a day in the first day of coming to one of the groups that I'm facilitating, and I talk a bit about how we go about the process. So shall I just talk about that for a moment?
That would be very interesting.
Okay. So this is just, how people teach or facilitate any kind of writing varies from person to person. So I can only tell you about the things that happen in my groups. But here's a sort of representative day. The memoir groups that I was leading in for about 6 or 7 years used to take place at the Thistle Inn in Wellington. And there used to be just room for a half circle of about 14 people. So in they'd come, and while I was sitting waiting to start, I'd ask them, I'd have a little piece of paper that said, write down 5 interesting things about yourself. And people would look blank, and one or two people would say, "There's nothing interesting about my life." And I think, okay, hang on, you're not either you've come because this is something to fill a Saturday morning, or you actually haven't started to examine your life, because in my life, my view, every life is interesting and extraordinary. There's always, everybody has something that they want to, that makes them who they are. So they write down things, and then we start, and I say, "Well, have you all written down 5 interesting things?" And they say, some people sort of shrug, and I said, "Look, it doesn't matter, because in this group, you are in charge of what happens. If you don't want to read it out, you're allowed to say pass. You don't have to do anything in my groups." But I said, and so what you write down actually belongs to you. But I said, just let's take this a little bit further. Let you now write down a secret in your family. And people go, "Oh, okay." And I say, "Hang on, it's okay. Remember, you don't have to read it out. This is just for you." And people start, at that point, you can see the people who are not going to make it. They start to get really uncomfortable. We do various exercises during the day, but what I am actually asking them to do is not to just do exercises. The process I'm really asking them to start is the process of interrogating memory. Because if you can't tell the truth about memory for yourself, then you can't for anybody else. I go back to what I said just a moment before. Nobody has to part with what they write down. What they're writing is a first draft. And that's what I say to so many people who are saying, "Well, I'm stuck with my writing." People forget or don't understand that a first draft is just that. It's just the words that you put down that belong to you. And very few writers actually have their first drafts published. So you have ownership. You have ownership of your words, you have ownership of your memories, but you need to actually do what the French writer Marguerite Duras, who I've followed for many years, calls entering the deep sleep of your life, finding what's down there in those spaces. For me, it's like breaking the surface of water. I've always been interested in water and its surfaces. I don't quite know where that began, but when we lived up north, up in Kirikiri, something I always remember, my mother was working as a cook in a boarding house, and we were living in that boarding house for a little while before we went over to our own piece of land. And there was a famous pianist called Lily Krauss, who at the end of World War II was touring with a community arts service. And she used to stay at the boarding house. She didn't like my mother's cooking. My mother, I thought, was a very good cook, but this was back in the 1940s, and she was a vegetarian, which my mother, who had been a country girl from a farm herself, didn't really get her head around. You had mutton or nothing. And anyway, Lily Krauss and her husband used to go swimming at the waterfall near to us. And I was about 6 at the time, and I remember that she asked me my mother if I could go swimming with them. And we went swimming, and she had this long hair, and it floated out like a great big lily with the lily pad of hair, this flood of hair, this torrent of hair. And she was out in the middle of the pool underneath the waterfall, and she said to me, I was sitting there in my little bathing suit beside it, and she said, "Come to me, little girl." And it was over to me to launch myself into the water and get from there to her. And thus I learned how to swim. So this was breaking the surface of water. And it's a very powerful memory. It's a deep, one of those deep memories. And this is what I'm asking people to go into, is to go in and find those first memories. I have, when we actually moved to the place, to our land, there was a reservoir, like Janet Frame. There was a reservoir in my life, and this was one that my father and mother, essentially, built on the land, because there was very drought stricken, and I used to swim in it, and there was little frogs there, and the frogs used to come and sit on me. So the reservoir was a place where I thought about things, and and then, later there was this water again. When Ian and I first got married, we lived by Lake Rotorua. We had just across the road, just the Lake Road was between us and the waterfront, and we used to sit there on the steps and sort of purple summer evenings and look at the lake and watch the lake. And so it's a very strong sensory perception. And of course, this is something else that I encourage people to do in the groups, is to explore their memories through senses. The touching, the smelling, the sense. I always remember Owen and I, her old friends, incidentally. We meet quite often, don't we, Owen? Yeah, we've both been to Monton as Catherine Mansfield Fellows at separate times.
Unfortunately.
Well, we have walked through the Luxembourg Gardens together, but that's another story. But I remember when I arrived there, the night that I arrived there, so Kirikiri, I'm not sure whether I mentioned it, but it was a citrus growing place then. I think it still is to some extent, but it was founded on citrus trees, planted by some rather curious Raj people from Shanghai, military people who'd been in Shanghai and Xiantin in the 1930s. But I stepped into Monton. I got off the train, and there was this overpowering scent of citrus. And I'd actually gone there to write memoir. To write my first volume of memoir, which was called At the End of Darwin Road, eventually. But I was suddenly transported entirely back into my childhood. I was in Kirikiri, in my mind's eye. I remember that night I lay down in the wonderful apartment, Palais Letitia, wasn't it? Yeah. And I dreamed that night of my mother. It was such a powerful provocation, if you like, of memory. And then the next day, we walked down the street, and for goodness sake, it's a town that's full of Raj people, and I could hear all these clipped British sounds, and exactly the way these people spoke. It was extraordinary. I don't know whether anybody else who's been in Monton has had such powerful sensory sensations as I did, but for me it was very fortuitous, because it took me right back into where I wanted to begin in my life.
Fiona, biography, autobiography, memoir, all these have played a large part in your writing over. 2 full memoirs of your own, one that you've mentioned. Why do you think this is such an important part of your writing? What draws you particularly to people's lives expressed in this way? Is it the fact of your rich imagination? You have a very powerful, evocative memory. What is it that draws you to this sort of writing?
I probably have not really written biography. perhaps could I just take a moment to clarify. There are different kinds of life writing. I mean, the wider term for this is life writing now. An autobiography is when you write your own story. A biography is when you write somebody else's. And a memoir to me is what I think of as just what the word implies, a collection or a selection of memories in which you don't necessarily tell everything about yourself. You just choose and shape something which has more the design of a fiction in a way. I mean, you're telling, the readers assume that you're telling the truth, but who really tells the whole truth about their life anyway? I certainly don't.
But Fiona, even in your novels, the mortal boy and this infinite heir, in effect, you've taken those people to tell their life stories, their biographies in fictional form. So that's such a strong part of your writing, isn't it? You must be drawn to that.
Yes, I suppose I am, and I think if I seem to dwell too much on the fact of being an only child, I do think that that probably I've listened to other people, that I've got my experience through listening to other people, whereas the people that I know who have lots of siblings, or even more than themselves, they've had people that they've done things with that, in a sense, I really didn't do as a young child, and I think that I listened. I mean, you had to listen. You had to listen for the tone of your parents' voice to see what sort of a mood they were in that particular day. I also, and maybe I'm not answering this very deeply. I'm sorry, I need to think about it more. But anything that you could listen to and listen into and overhear was fantastic, like the party line. It was wonderful. There was in both Kirikiri and Waipu, there were, I think the maximum number of people that you could have on a party line was 10, and we were short, long, or any other signal. You put your finger very carefully on the button and you lifted the phone up and you listened in. And you know all about what was happening in the valley. It was fantastic. I always remember that there was a woman in Waipu. Forgive me if any of her descendants are here, but her name was Dolly Mackenzie. And Dolly Mackenzie was known for listening in because she wasn't as careful always. And I remember somebody saying, something being said about her, and I heard about this, and she said down the phone, "Don't you dare say that about me." So of course the whole valley knew that, she proclaimed herself. That was how you glean things about other people's lives. I suppose it's a form of gossip, and gossip's nice, as long as it's not used hurtfully. In the case of Jean Batten, again, I think place plays a big part in what incites me to write something. In the case of Jean Batten, I was working as a librarian in the Rotorua Public Library, and Jean Batten had been born a couple of blocks away from the library, and people used to come into the library. It was sort of, they expected you to know everything. We were the Google of the 1950s, really, and because Jean Batten had disappeared and was missing for a number of years, missing from public view. People would come in and say, "Oh, did you know where Jean Batten is?" And of course, we had no idea. What she was actually doing was living in Jamaica in the same road as Ian Fleming, and having a high old time with them. So my research told me. I love bits. I love research. I love putting the little fragments of things together and trying to put two and two together. So don't believe everything in my fictions. You know, I'm serious. I mean, they're not biographies. I've done the best to tell it as nearly as I can find out. But I've imagined what people say to each other. I don't invent, you know, relatives that don't exist and things like that. For instance, there was a woman. Sadly, she's now died, and I would never reveal who she was. But she seriously believed that she was Jean Batten's daughter. And I spent months trying to actually find out whether that could have been true or not. It became clear by searching through papers past and looking up various things to do with her flying record and so forth, that Jean Batten simply was not in New Zealand at the time of this woman's birth, or in any time that year. And so you need to do a lot of hunting through fragments of things in order to try and get some broader picture. If I had found any evidence to suggest that she had, what did come out of that was that the Batten family knew that that she had this belief, and so I was able to put them in touch with each other, and they gave her a sort of loving embrace as if she was part of the family. But none of that is in the book because it simply wasn't true. Albert Black, well, very briefly, I'll make this really brief, but I was interested in him because he was hanged charged with murder the week before I left school. I was 15. It was known as the jukebox murder. I believe it was manslaughter. Albert Black was a 20-year-old Irish boy who'd come as an assistant immigrant, and it touched me deeply at the time that he had been hanged. I don't believe in the death penalty under any circumstances, and I know that there are times when it's tempting to believe that it would be helpful, but I can't bring myself to that point, or helpful, or that they deserved it or something, however you like to put it. I can never bring myself to that point. But I was touched too because he was Irish. He was a Protestant Irish boy who'd emigrated to New Zealand, and that was my dad. And when I wrote him, I had to imagine although I knew some people, I did meet some people who knew him. I had to in fact invent a personality for him. So I drew on my dad. Albert Black is like my dad. Well, since I've written the book, I have uncut various of his relatives have been in touch with me from Ireland and now from Canada, and they say that's what he was like. They'd known Albert when he was alive. You drew, so coincidentally, I kind of had got it right, it seems. They say that's what, we knew Albert, that's the sort of boy he was, yeah, which is very exciting, yeah. So it's kind of going into things that interest me, yeah.
Perhaps another reading, Fiona, if you have one for us.
Okay.
Time is getting on. I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience. So
Right.
Some of you may well need the opportunity for that.
Okay. So this is not a long reading, but it's from an essay called Pure Duras, which is about Marguerite Duras, and she was a French writer who I became very interested in, again, when I was a young woman. She was also a screenwriter, and she wrote the screenplay for Hiroshima Mon Amour, which I had seen when I was a newly married woman. It was very sensual. I always liked the sensuality of Duras. And this is just a little piece of that from this essay, and I travelled quite a lot in search of the places that she came from. She was born in Vietnam alongside the Mekong River, and I've been searching for her, and various things. Anyway, here's the reading. I might have given up on Duras, but I kept bumping into reminders of her and her life. She was, after all, still alive then. I came across her collection of essays, Practicalities, published in 1987. My concept of what an essay might be was turned on its head. These were more like conversations, reflections on her life, quite short, often terse, sometimes funny, but also domestic, the thoughts of a woman who ran a household. I loved that she provided a list of household products that she was never without. Table salt, pepper, wine, pasta, potatoes, rice, tinned tomatoes, yogurt, eggs, washing powder. I looked at my own list for last week, which begins paper towels, blueberries, lettuce, wine, toothpaste. These are items that are always in my pantry. The blueberries are frozen ones in winter, or somewhere in the house. Batteries, butter, dishwashing liquid, and camembert, plus a particular kind of lemon vinaigrette that is better than the one I make. More Wilson's if you're in Wellington. I stand at my kitchen bench and make these lists. My kitchen is a pale lemon shade. On the windowsill stand many blue glass objects, the colour of the sea and sky. All down one wall hang old Royal Doulton plates covered in painted pansies. My mother loved pansies, and these plates come from her life. On a shelf stands a row of creamy-coloured cups decorated with a shadowy pale green pattern of leaves, like tracings, part of a tea set given to my parents by our neighbours when they left the farm up north. Beyond the window, above the bench, lies a courtyard surrounded by native trees that Ian and I planted when we came to this house, and inside those a half circle of white roses put in for a family wedding. Below me, on the other side, stands a grove of olive trees just above the lip of the cliff that falls to the road far below. These were planted by my grandsons. I never do get to gather the olives. They are out of reach, but birds feast on them as they ripen. So many birds. I add olives to the list.
Perhaps briefly, Fiona, before we ask for questions, in a long writing career, you have made many friends within the profession, people like Vincent O'Sullivan and Patricia Grace, Whitty Hilmyra, and people overseas, such as Angela Carter and Margaret Atwood and so on. Would you like to talk just briefly about the importance of that sort of professional fraternity, the writing fraternity, and what part it's played for you?
Yes, well, I've got this chap that I meet at our local village quite often at the place called the Crazy Rabbit. I meet him when he's visiting his daughter about once every 3 months or so, and that's a guy called Owen Marshall. So these friendships are great to have, and I like to think that I have friends from many areas of life, not just writers, but it is important, I think, to have people who actually understand the work that you do, that when you say that you're working today, they know that work means work. And yeah, I just think it's like any profession. It's a community of people that you operate inside, and we understand each other. And that's really important. And I've had the good fortune to be invited to a lot of festivals. Thank you very much, Wairarapa. And I think you make friends on the road, and it's great. And I'm immensely grateful for that.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? You'd have to speak up, I think. Any questions for Fiona?
Please do. I like answering the questions.
Yeah. Don't be shy. All right, well, it doesn't appear to be, Fiona, so I'm going to plague you with another question of my own. You are noted for your commitments to causes, not just within the writing fraternity in terms of New Zealand Society of Authors or the Book Council and so on, but wider. The Pike River tragedy, for example. You and Ian actually went onto the picket line, didn't you, in terms of that?
Did.
So would you like to make a comment about why you feel in your busy life you need also to get involved with these sort of measures of injustice that you see in society?
Well, I think writers have to live in the world. I don't think that we live in ivory towers. I think that if you care about the world, if you have values, I mean, I'm not terribly interested in writing that, and I mean, everybody has their own tastes in writing, but I'm not interested in writing that doesn't have some sense of the writer's values. And if I get caught up in something, I believe that you need to act on it. I mean, look, Pike River is an ongoing tragedy, and I don't actually understand some of the things that have happened there. And I don't want to get into some sort of political argument about it. It's a tragedy that sealing the mine when it was sealed still doesn't seem to be a great idea to me. When there were boreholes about to be opened, put down to it's a huge issue. When there are boreholes about to be put down for some miners to be seen, I would like the mine to have been left open long enough for the opportunity to remain for those people to be retrieved from the mine. And it was said that there was not enough money and that it had to stop at some point. And I do understand that governments have limited budgets. But we spend millions on bringing people back from war graves overseas. And for me, it just seemed that they needed to keep going for longer. And we had some ties with the West Coast. So one day we were watching the picket line, and this was when Ian was still alive, and I said to Ian, there's just this little handful of people sitting on the road together, and I said, they look really lonely. I feel that we should be there. And he said, well, yes, I think we should. So he said, well, shall we go? So I rang Damien O'Connor and said, at Parliament, and said, look, we don't want to intrude if we wouldn't be welcome there. But will you ask them if they'd like us to go? And they said, yes, can you come tomorrow? So we got on a plane and went. Because I think words are fine, but you're judged in the end by your actions and what you believe in.
Thank you, Fiona. Perhaps time for just one final question. We've got a question? Or good?
Hello, Robin. Oh, Robin, that's a very searching question. Was I absent when I was doing those things? It's an particularly interesting question because there's the physical presence and there's the emotional presence. And in fact, when I record in the book that when I'd finished writing the Albert this mortal boy. Ian said to me, "Thank you for coming back to me." And I said, "But I've never been away. I haven't been away." And he said, "Yes, you have." And I do understand that a writer who's totally immersed in their work, that there is a sort of an absence. But I also I've toured quite a lot. And I look back and I think that Ian and I had quite an unusual marriage, and that we both believed that in a certain amount of personal freedom. And don't jump to conclusions about that. What I mean by that is that we both had passions for things. Ian was deeply involved in the latter part of his life with the Cambodian community. And how that happened is another story all in itself. But he used to go to Cambodia in a voluntary capacity to work with landmine victims, and he would go at least twice a year for some weeks. And I would be doing my thing, I would be writing or touring or whatever. And our marriage, I think, it was like everybody's marriage. It had its ups and downs, but because we gave each other the space to be who we wanted to be and to follow our dreams, I think it was quite a successful one. I think, looking back. Yeah.
Fiona's comments remind me of Janet Frame's saying that the writer lives in the room 2 inches behind the eyes. Yeah. And that the writer is often living almost in a world of his or her own, and has to come back from that sometimes to the existing.
Do you find that?
I do find that.
Yes.
Yeah. Time for one more question, perhaps, if you wish. All right. Well, one other thing I was going to say, Fiona, and that was to just touch briefly on the flowering of women's writing in New Zealand at the moment. I happened to look the other day at the role of fiction winners in the book awards and the Ockhams, and I see that for the last 6 years, women writers have in fact won that prize, and it's a wonderful thing in a way, isn't it? But would you like to comment on this flowering of women's writing in New Zealand and in the world, in fact?
Yes, well, there's certainly been a change. I mean, when I began to write seriously, and may I just say that this year actually marks the 60th year, 60 years since I actually said, I'm going to be a writer. This is what I want to do with my life. and no, it was pretty much a chap's world in those days. There are times when you can look back and feel a bit sour about it, but I should also say that I had some serious male mentors, people like Bruce Mason, and some people in radio theatre who I was a radio dramatist for many years. People like William Austin, Arthur Jones. They felt that I had something going for me, and I'm immensely grateful to the opportunities that they gave me, and it has changed now. I don't really know that I can make some broad generalisation, but I've certainly seen the change in the whole writing world. But when talking of making opportunities for people, I suppose perhaps, shall I just say this, and perhaps this is a point where we're just about there, I'd like to say I'm immensely grateful to the platform that people like Mary and Peter Biggs provide. They're people who don't just talk about the arts, they do things in them. And that's another kind of passion, which as a writer I'm immensely grateful for. The number of people who've made opportunities for me and for other writers is serious and something that I'm very grateful for,
Thank you. And the very last thing, what is your next project?
Oh, Owen,
No?
there's supposed to be a novel. Let's just say there's supposed to be a novel.
Right. Okay. Well, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of the time, and I do think we want to show our appreciation to Fiona for a wonderful session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Owen. Which I didn't thank you.